Glory Cloud Podcast, Episode 43. Well, stay tuned for more images of the Spirit this week. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Glory Cloud Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cahy, and I'm joined by our co-host, Charles Lee Irons. Welcome back, Lee.
Hello, Chris. It's great to be with you again.
I'm excited to continue our discussion of images of the Spirit. Before we get started, I will just remind our listeners that we do have a show notes page over at meredithklein.com/podcast. We like to list especially the scripture passages that we talk about in the course of the episode. But if we mention any books or articles or any other resources, we try our best to link to those there so you can make use of those as well. We appreciate those who continue to give us 5-star ratings on iTunes. If you haven't done that, that would really help us. It helps people find our podcast as they are searching for good theological content. And if you have friends who are listening to the show, if you could ask them to rate us as well, that would really, really help. If you would like to contribute to what we're doing to help us cover the monthly cost of hosting the audio files, there is a donate button at meredithklein.com/podcast on the right-hand side of the page. All right, Lee, we are on chapter 2 this week, a priestly model of the image of God.
Yeah, this is an interesting chapter. This is a rich chapter with lots of really good stuff in it. And I think that our listeners are going to really enjoy digging into this. Basically, this chapter, as the title indicates, is talking about the replication of the glory spirit in the form of the tabernacle that Moses built in the wilderness, and in the form of Aaron's robes. So it's a priestly model of the image of God, priestly in the sense that it is related to these two key elements of the Mosaic economy, the tabernacle and the priesthood.
So it's an interesting connection between creation and the Mosaic covenant, but it also explains why Klein sees Adam as a priest in the garden.
Yeah, that's one of the payoffs of this whole thing, is that it helps to justify why he thinks that Adam was a priest, and then conversely, it helps to understand why he thinks that Aaron was a second Adam figure.
Okay, well, I'm excited to dive in here.
Yeah, so let's do that. So he starts off by reminding us again of how the glory spirit hovered over the formless and void in Genesis 1, verse 2. And he reminds us that in the original creation, as the glory spirit is hovering, what is it doing? Well, it's reproducing its likeness. And so we see the likeness of the glory spirit in the original creation in two ways. One, we see it in the sense that the whole cosmos is being reproduced as an image of the glory spirit, because the whole cosmos is God's holy palace, a cosmic sanctuary where God is dwelling. But we also see it not only in the whole cosmos, but in the Garden of Eden itself. And so Klein argues that the Garden of Eden is basically a microcosm of the cosmic sanctuary. And to make that point, he takes us all the way to Ezekiel chapter 28. That's the famous passage about the Prince of Tyre and his fall. And he argues that the Prince of Tyre is compared to a certain figure who existed in paradise. And he speaks of this, Ezekiel speaks of this original paradise scene, and he talks about a covering cherub that was present there on the holy mountain of God. This phrase, a covering cherub, is very interesting. It's used twice in Ezekiel 28, verse 14, and a few verses later in verse 16 as well. Of course, this reminds you, if you fast forward to the tabernacle, this reminds you of the two cherubim that covered the Ark of the Covenant.
Right.
So he's arguing that even though Ezekiel 28 is this prophecy of the fall of the Prince of Tyre, yet the way in which Ezekiel is looking at this, he is describing it in a figure as similar to what was going on in the garden. And so he's using Ezekiel 28 to help us understand that Eden itself was a microcosm of the cosmic sanctuary.
Wow.
Another verse that Klein uses to support this concept is in Isaiah chapter 4. This is an eschatological picture, but it helps us to see to picture what Eden was like. So Isaiah 4 verse 5 says, "Then the Lord will create over the whole site of Mount Zion and over her assemblies a cloud by day and smoke and the shining of a flaming fire by night. For over all the glory there will be a canopy." So this idea of the canopy, this idea that there was a covering cherub and a canopy that covered Eden, just like with the Mosaic tabernacle, where you have the various layers of the coverings of the tabernacle, and you have the glory cloud coming into the tabernacle as well. So he's arguing then that there's all these parallels from creation to the tabernacle to the eschatological fulfillment.
Wow. Is the connection with the word canopy? I'm guessing that's the word maybe firmament.
Mm-hmm. I don't know.
Okay.
I haven't looked it up.
Okay.
Yeah.
So connecting creation with this priestly aspect of the Mosaic covenant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, I think the word is sukkah.
Okay.
Which means covering or pavilion. Similar to the Feast of Tabernacles, which is called Sukkot.
Okay.
So anyway, having then set the stage and looked at Genesis 1 and seeing Eden itself as a microcosm of the cosmic sanctuary, Klein now turns to the book of Exodus. And he shows us all the interesting parallels between what's going on in Exodus and what happened in Genesis 1 and 2. And so he's arguing then that Exodus, what God is doing in the Exodus, bringing Israel out of Egypt and then bringing them to Mount Sinai and then building the tabernacle, that this is a recreation event. And so, one of the things you see right away is the glory spirit is there, hovering on top of Mount Sinai, just as the glory cloud was hovering over the formless and the void in Genesis 1-2. Except now the formless and void is the wilderness. Sinai is in the wilderness. So the glory spirit's hovering over the wilderness, which is a picture of the formless and void of Genesis 1. And then as it hovers there, what does it do?
It reproduces its likeness.
Just like we saw in Genesis 1.
That's right.
Reproduces its likeness in the world below. And so you have the creation of the tabernacle. The tabernacle then is basically like Eden. It is a picture of the cosmic sanctuary. And he points out some interesting things here. He shows us that just as in Genesis 1, where you have the fiat and the fulfillments, God said, "Let there be light." That's the fiat. And then the fulfillment, and then there was light. In the same way, you have a series of fiats and fulfillments in the second half of the book of Exodus, beginning in Exodus 25. He says that Exodus 25 through 31 is all the fiats, and then Exodus 35 to 40 is all the fulfillments. So the fiats are God speaking to Moses and saying, "You shall make," and it's repeated over and over again, "You shall make the tabernacle, you shall make the lampstand, you shall make the altar." et cetera, et cetera. It's all throughout every major section where it talks about some unique thing or a unique element of the tabernacle. It begins with that phrase, "You shall make." So those are the fiats. Then, of course, in between, after 31, you have Exodus 32 to 34, which is that interlude that deals with the golden calf episode and all that. But then, beginning in Exodus 35, you have the fulfillments. And just as God said, "You shall make the tabernacle, the lampstand, the altar, etc.," then we're told, He made the tabernacle, He made the lampstand, He made the altar. Now, who is the He? My English Standard Version says it's probably Bezalel. It could be Moses, perhaps. It's not really clear. But Bezalel is the one that God sets apart and says, he's going to be filled with my Spirit. And so it seems very likely that it's Bezalel who actually implements the fiats.
He was sort of the craftsman, right? Who was commissioned for that.
That's right.
Okay.
And some other things that you see in this section of Exodus that hark back to creation is the Sabbath motif.
Right.
The Sabbath is mentioned several times in this section. Exodus 31, verses 12 through 17, and again in Exodus 35, verses 2 and 3. So the Sabbath is explicit there. And then another interesting connection is that Moses himself is viewed almost as if he is like God in a sense, because after the completion of the tabernacle, in Exodus 39, verse 43, it says, "And Moses saw all the work, and behold, they had done it. As the Lord had commanded, so they had done it. Then Moses blessed them." And then in the next chapter, Exodus 40, verse 33, "He erected the court around the tabernacle and the altar and set up the screen of the gate of the court. So Moses finished the work." Doesn't that sound like Genesis?
It does.
After God completed the creation, He looked and He saw that it was very good. And then we're told that He finished His work that He had done, Genesis 2:2, and He rested on the seventh day.
Mm-hmm.
And so then the glory cloud comes and covers the tent of meeting and fills the tabernacle, which harks back to God resting on the seventh day.
Right.
So there's all these connections here that show that the creation of the tabernacle is like the creation of the world. And so just as the tabernacle is God's dwelling place, God's sanctuary, we're not shocked then to see that that's what the world is. The world is also God's sanctuary. And the tabernacle is simply a microcosm of it.
Okay. I don't want to get too far off track with this, but I can even see here how he's, in his thinking, developing the megapolis and metapolis. The world was to be God's sanctuary, and the fall doesn't mean that that's no longer his goal. He's just achieving it by remedial means here.
That's right.
So.
Yeah, absolutely. And the tabernacle is just the beginning. Of course, they're going to go into the land eventually. And then the tabernacle, which was sort of a temporary structure, is going to be replaced by a permanent structure. And the goal of going into the land was to make the whole land God's dwelling place, God's sanctuary. The whole land was going to be holy unto the Lord. And it was all focused upon this epicenter at the tabernacle or the temple. And then another really cool thing that Klein points out is that just as at creation, you have the climax of creation is when God says, "Let us make man." On the sixth day, God creates man in His own image. And we already saw, in previous episodes, in Images of the Spirit, chapter 1, that man himself is made in the image of the glory Spirit. So lo and behold, you get to the book of Exodus and you see something similar. you see God fashioning man in the image of the glory spirit. And you see this in two places. You see this with Moses himself, and you see it with Aaron. With Moses, you see it when he goes into the cloud on the top of the mountain, and he comes down off the mountain, and his face is shining with the glory of God.
Right.
And then you see it with Aaron, because Aaron is given these special priestly garments, and that's what he's going to really focus on here in this chapter. These special priestly garments that are also replicas of the glory spirit.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Klein's analysis of Aaron's clothing.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And how he ties that in with the tabernacle as well.
Mm-hmm. And creation.
Yeah. So what is God doing in both of these things? With Eden, he's creating the Garden of Eden to be a holy realm. And of course, it's ultimately going to be expanded, like you were saying, to megapolis, to include the whole creation. And then in Exodus, God is also establishing his holy kingdom as a holy realm. Really, it starts with the tabernacle itself, the physical space of the tabernacle, but even the nation itself, as they're camped around the tabernacle, they are becoming a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So that sacred space is being radiated outward, and it is also including the nation.
Right. Sacred space really is vital to the whole Mosaic economy.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Yeah, as we've talked about in previous episodes, this whole idea of theocracy, right?
Mm-hmm.
That God's kingdom is not just simply the abstract idea of God's providential rule over all things, but it specifically has this idea of a geographical area that is set apart as holy unto God, and nothing impure can enter into that sacred space.
Yeah, the realm, right?
Yeah. And also the fact that it's guarded, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have the covering cherubim. You also have the priests and the Levites that are to, protect the boundaries of that sacred space and not allow anything impure to enter in. So yeah, it's a very, very strong physical, geographical concept.
Yeah, you see it even in the architecture of the tabernacle. You've got that outer veil.
Mm-hmm.
What do you call that? That really sets that space apart as
mm-hmm.
holy. And then, as you were saying that, I was thinking of the distribution of the land to the 12 tribes, and borders are just so crucial to that.
Mm-hmm.
This is my plot of ground here, says God. That's
right. And the veil is there to separate and to keep out mm-hmm. people that don't belong there,
Right. And the same goes for the land. I mean, the land was to be holy, and they were to keep out impure people.
Right.
So
based on everything we've seen so far, if what's going on with the making of the tabernacle is that God is doing an act of recreation that is modeled after what's going on in Genesis 1 and 2, then we shouldn't be surprised if we find that when you look at the physical description of the tabernacle itself, you're going to see two things in it. You're going to see aspects of the tabernacle that remind you of the cosmic sanctuary, the heavens and the earth, and you're also going to see things in the tabernacle that remind you of the microcosmic sanctuary, which is Eden.
Right.
And that's what you see. You do see both, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even the physical partitioning of the tabernacle into those various zones, right? You have the courtyard, and then you have the box within the courtyard that is itself divided into two sections, the holy place and then the most holy place. And there's a veil separating those two. So you have three compartments, which corresponds to earth, and then you have the heavens, and then you have the heaven of the heavens, the most holy place. And when you get into that heaven of the heavens, what do you see? You see God seated upon his throne. In the tabernacle, of course, the throne of God is empty because God is not physical, but the throne is there. It's the Ark of the Covenant. It's a seat. And there you have the covering cherub protecting that place, that holy throne of God. But you also see Eden symbolism, right? You see the lampstand, which is, this picture of like a plant that is growing up out of the earth, and it's filled with oil that is illuminating, and you have all the artwork, which is filled with symbolism of flowers and gourds and all kinds of things that remind you of the Garden of Eden.
Mm-hmm. I don't know, is the canopy over that Holy of Holies and the holy place, I don't know, may image creation as well in some way? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think so. You're talking about the physical covering over the tent?
Right.
Yeah. Wouldn't that be what Klein was saying before when he was quoting from Isaiah chapter 4, verse 5, the covering canopy of glory?
Right.
So even though Genesis 1 and 2 doesn't specifically mention that canopy of glory, you can deduce it by looking at these later passages that go back to the Edenic situation. So you've got some additional cosmic motifs in the tabernacle would be the different layers of the coverings of the tabernacle. Mm-hmm. And Klein points out something really interesting here. He points out that we know about the different layers because it talks about all the different types of animal skins and layer upon layer, but then he ties that into what you see at Mount Sinai when in Deuteronomy 4:11 it says that Moses is talking to the Israelites, and he says, "You came near and stood at the foot of the mountain, while the mountain burned with fire to the heart of heaven, wrapped in three things: darkness, clouds, and thick darkness." And so he takes those three as being like layers. There's darkness, then there's clouds, and then there's thick darkness. The word thick darkness is sometimes translated as gloom, or perhaps even heavy clouds. But he takes those three terms there as being the three layers that correspond to the several layers of the coverings of the tabernacle. Also, he points out that, remember, in the outer court mm-hmm. of the tabernacle, there is a laver.
Right.
Yeah, and he says that stands for the heavenly sea, which is like the firmament.
Okay.
But then there are also Eden motifs in the temple. Well, more in the temple than in the tabernacle. But the temple, of course, is just a more permanent version of the tabernacle. But in 1 Kings 6, when it describes Solomon building the temple, it talks about flowers and palm trees and cherubim being, the various designs that are either embroidered into the different veils or, different parts of the building itself. And then also, if you fast forward all the way to Ezekiel 47, which is the eschatological temple, there's a river flowing out from the threshold, and there's also the tree of life. So again, we see Eden motifs connecting all of these things together. The original creation in Eden, the tabernacle, the temple, and the eschatological temple. Mm. Which is not a literal temple that's going to be rebuilt in some imagined millennium. It's the eschatological fulfillment. It is the New Jerusalem that comes down out of heaven from God. It's the final state.
Right. And it's the same theme that he was working with in chapter 1, but I'm still struck by what he said in chapter 1 about God being the temple where the church dwells, and the church being the temple where the Spirit dwells, mm-hmm. which is what we see when we get to the book of Revelation.
Yeah, there's this amazing mixing, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, is the temple us? Is it the church? Or is it God? It's like, it just sort of gets all merged together.
Right. So So we see it in the architecture, both of the tabernacle and the temple. What about Aaron's robes, his garments?
Yeah, so this is really interesting. Now here, what Klein does is he points to an interesting verse in 2 Corinthians. I find this utterly fascinating. In 2 Corinthians 5, this is the passage where Paul is talking about our resurrection hope. But what's so interesting is that when Paul describes our resurrection body that we're looking forward to, he describes it using two metaphors, and these two metaphors seem incompatible with each other, but he blends them together. On the one hand, he calls our resurrection body a tent or a dwelling, but on the other hand, he calls it a garment with which we're clothed. And he just mixes the two metaphors. He says, for we know that if the tent that is our earthly home is destroyed, so that's our present mortal body, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. So that's our resurrection body. For in this tent we groan, longing to put on our heavenly dwelling, if indeed by putting it on we may not be found naked. So now he's talking about clothing, right? If indeed by putting it on we may not be found naked, that is, naked as just a pure soul without a body. For while we are still in this tent, we groan, being burdened, not that we would be unclothed, but that we would be further clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. And he who has prepared us for this very thing is God, who has given us the Spirit as a guarantee. So this, Klein refers to it as a curious combination of imagery, and he argues that this provides us with a clue to understand Aaron's robes. If Paul is saying that our resurrection body is both a garment and a dwelling or a tabernacle, then this helps us to see that Aaron's robes, even though they're technically clothing, could be understood as corresponding to the tabernacle.
Okay.
And so he says that we can see some striking similarities between the tabernacle and the priestly garments of Aaron. Quote, he says, page 42, the tabernacle is a replica of the glory spirit, and Aaron's vestments are a replica of the tabernacle, and thus also of the glory spirit.
Wow.
That's a pretty amazing sentence. The tabernacle is a replica of the glory spirit. Okay, we've seen that. And Aaron's vestments are a replica of the tabernacle, and thus also of the glory spirit. So Aaron's clothing then corresponds to the various layers of the tabernacle and so on and so forth. And so he's going to go through here and give us some things that help us to see that. For example, he starts off with Exodus chapter 28, verse 2. Exodus 28 is the chapter that describes Aaron's vestments. And this is what it says, you shall make holy garments for Aaron, your brother. So Moses is the one being addressed here. For glory and for beauty. And so Klein points out, aha, look at that. The purpose of the garments is that they are for glory and for beauty. Isn't that basically the glory spirit?
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, given the connections that he's making, it really is fascinating that would correspond to creation as well. It makes sense that we should look at the natural creation and just marvel at the beauty that we see. But I digress. Carry on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, when you're looking at Aaron's beautiful garments, you're looking at man as he was created, or at least as he was intended to be, as a replica of the glory spirit. Man's body itself is for beauty and for glory. So obviously we have these two words here, for glory and for beauty. Glory is kavod. We know that that's the glory spirit. What about beauty? Well, Klein points out that this word beauty, tiferet in Hebrew, is also used in the book of Isaiah in reference to the glory theophany. So, for example, in Isaiah 28, verse 5, in that day the Lord of hosts will be a crown of glory and a diadem of beauty to the remnant of his people. So that word beauty there is the same word tiferet from Exodus 28. Or again in Isaiah 60, verse 19, the sun shall be no more your light by day, nor for brightness shall the moon give you light, but the Lord will be your everlasting light, and your God will be your glory. Now, the word glory there in the ESV is this word beauty.
Oh, okay.
Tiferet.
It's interesting that it used the English word that we would normally use for kavod.
Yeah, you would think it's kavod, but it's not. It's tiferet. And then also in Isaiah 63, verse 15, he says, look down from heaven and see from your holy and beautiful habitation. So what is God's holy and beautiful habitation? That's heaven. That's the glory spirit, right?
Right.
And there's the word beautiful again, which is tiferet. And in the context, it's very clear that we're talking about the glory spirit, because right in the verses just before that, it talks about the Spirit is the one that came and divided the waters and led Israel through them and then brought them into the land and gave them rest. So the glory cloud is specifically mentioned. The Spirit is specifically mentioned right there in that context. So seeing the word beauty then as being a reference to the glory spirit, as well as the word glory, which is not, that's obvious, but seeing the word beauty as well helps us to see what God said there. You shall make holy garments for Aaron your brother for glory and for beauty. That is to represent the glory and the physical theophany of the Spirit of God. And so when you look at everything that's going on here with Moses and Aaron, not just with Aaron, but also with Moses, because Moses himself is a priestly figure. And so you see, for example, Moses' transfigured face, which was his garment of glory. You see Aaron's different garments that he's supposed to wear. And we'll have a link to this on the show notes. But if you see, some modern artistic renderings of the vestments of Aaron, you'll see that there's different layers there. You start off with the very first layer closest to his skin is a fine linen tunic. The next layer is the robe of blue. And then the next layer is the ephod itself.
Which
and
I think...
ephod... Go ahead.
I think it looks like an apron.
Yeah, that's a great description of the ephod. And then on top of the ephod is the breastplate, which has the 12 stones representing the 12 tribes. But that those three layers there correspond to the different layers of the tabernacle, of the covering of the tabernacle, except they're in reverse order. And so the innermost layer of the tabernacle is the one that's closest to the physical glory, whereas the outermost layer of Aaron's vestments is the one that's closest to the physical glory. So the outermost layer is the one that has the most symbolism that corresponds to the glory. The outer layer is made of, it says that it has different colors in it. I'm reading here from Exodus 28, verse 6. They shall make the ephod of gold, of blue and purple and scarlet yarns, and of fine twined linen skillfully worked. So especially the gold and the scarlet. So gold is, symbolizes the glory spirit, but scarlet as well, which is sort of a reddish color, a dark red. Klein argues that that's similar to the color of fire. So he calls that the flame-colored linen. But also the blue and the purple, which remind you of the firmament and God's, the heavens where God dwells. So all these amazing colors, this kind of sparkling, dazzling colors are corresponding to the glory cloud itself. So he's basically saying, and I'm almost quoting here, he says that Aaron's priestly robe and his ephod are basically a scaled down version of the tent itself.
Yeah, I can see that.
And if I recall, he even remember the thing about the various cords that hold down the tabernacle.
Yes.
Yeah. And he thinks that he's kind of speculating here, but he thinks that might be even symbolized in, there's that breastplate that goes right on top of his breast, his chest, with the 12 stones, but it's got 4 cords, one on each corner. The top 2 go up to the shoulder pieces, and the bottom 2 go around his back and tie it down. He's thinking that might even be corresponding to the cords that hold down the various coverings of the tabernacle and go down to the tent pegs.
That's right. I remember him talking about that.
Yeah. He also argues that the breastplate itself is the Holy of Holies.
And are those stones the same ones that we read about in Revelation in the New Jerusalem?
Honestly, I haven't checked, but I think that there are a lot of parallels there.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's identical, though.
Okay.
He also points out that both the tabernacle itself and Aaron and his robes are consecrated with holy oil, symbolizing the Spirit.
And then you also have the Sabbath dedication for both the priest in his garments and the tabernacle. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, both of them take 7 days to be dedicated and made holy so that they can be put into operation. Again, going back to creation itself.
So that covers what Klein sees in Old Testament evidence for this. But then he turns to the New Testament and sees glory investiture mentioned there as well, especially in the armor that Paul talks about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in Ephesians 6. Mm-hmm. He talks about the helmet of salvation. And he actually also mentions that in 1 Thessalonians 5:8. And it's interesting there in Ephesians 6, the context is spiritual warfare, right?
Right.
And so, I don't know about you, but I think most of us, when we read that passage, we're not thinking of the description of all this armor and weaponry as a priest.
Right.
But we tend to think of it as just sort of a Roman soldier, right? Mm-hmm. But Klein argues that, wait a minute, what is the task of the priest in the Old Testament?
To guard the temple.
Yeah, to guard the temple against the attacks of the enemy, against the attacks of that which is opposed to God. Mm-hmm. And so he's arguing then that we should look at the description of the soldier in Ephesians 6 as a priestly image. And one thing that sort of supports that is the fact that the helmet of salvation is referred to in the Old Testament in Isaiah 59, where it talks about the Lord. Remember that whole passage where the Lord saw that, that everyone was full of sin and transgression, and justice was being trampled, and so the Lord saw it, and it displeased him. He saw that there was no one to intercede. So then it says, he put on righteousness as a breastplate and a helmet of salvation on his head. He put on garments of vengeance for clothing and wrapped himself in zeal as a cloak. And so that seems to be a priestly metaphor there, especially the part about the zeal.
Right.
Which reminds you of Phineas. And so the helmet of salvation is used right there in that context, in that priestly context. So perhaps that supports his argument that the soldier in Ephesians 6 should also be viewed as having a priestly aspect to it.
Okay.
But really what he wants to focus on here in this section on glory investiture in the New Testament is he really wants to focus on the book of Revelation. Because in Revelation you have two visions, one at the beginning and one at the end, that are both priestly. except that the one in Revelation chapter 1 is a vision of Christ, and he's being pictured as a priest, like Aaron. But the one at the end, in Revelation 21 and 22, it's a vision not of Christ, but of the church. But the church also is described in priestly terms, and therefore Klein's argument is that the church is being recreated in the image of Christ.
Right. And, I mean, it makes sense that as a biblical theologian, he'd want to go there because now we've gone from creation to consummation at this point.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's look at Christ as the antitype of Aaron as royal priest.
Yeah, so I mean, there are elements in there that are kingly. So Klein will say that Christ in Revelation 1 is a royal priest. He's not simply a priest. But look at all the priestly elements. Number one, where is Christ standing? It says that he's standing in the midst of the golden lampstands.
Right. Okay. Yes. So he's there in the temple space. Yeah.
So just like you picture Aaron, right, in the tabernacle, and he's tending to the lampstand and all that. And so by having Christ be pictured here as standing in the midst of the 7 golden lampstands, Revelation 1, verses 12 and 13, right away we're being told that he's a priest. It also says that he has the keys, verse 18. I have the keys of death and Hades. And Klein argues that this is another priestly metaphor because the priest receives these keys at his ordination and is able to open and shut access to the presence of God. Okay. Another key term here is in verse 13 when it says that Christ, or one like a son of man, is clothed with a long robe. And that word long robe is a unique Greek word that is also used in the Septuagint in Exodus.
Okay.
To describe Aaron's robe. It's a robe that goes all the way down to the feet.
Plus, verse 13 talks about a golden sash around his chest.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, you are seeing that priestly garment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the sash was mentioned in Exodus 28 and verse 4. Talks about the breastpiece, the ephod, the robe, the coat of checkered work, the turban, and the sash. So the sash is mentioned again in Revelation 1:13 around his chest. So all these things then show us, we're used to thinking of the book of Hebrews as being the key place to go to see how to see that Aaron is the type and Christ is the antitype, that he is the true priest, the great high priest, of which Aaron was simply a foreshadow. But I think it's really neat to see that it's not just the book of Hebrews. It's also in Revelation chapter 1. Even though Revelation chapter 1 never uses the word priest to describe the exalted Christ, yet that's clearly what you're seeing. You just look at the description of it. You just picture it. And you're seeing Christ as a priest.
And another connection just came to mind as we were discussing this from chapter 1, where he talks about these early chapters of Revelation. He talks about how the bright light associated with Christ isn't just this blinding light, but it's also colorful, and he appeals to the rainbow that appears. And I can't help but think of that breastplate with all those colorful stones.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Again, like Lee said, we'll have a link to the artist's recreation of this, Aaronic priestly garment, but the breastplate really has a very rainbow-like array of precious stones on it. Okay. So now let's skip to the last few chapters of Revelation and the description of the church.
Yeah, so there you also see priestly imagery. again, just like we saw with in 2 Corinthians 5, there's a combination of clothing and building metaphors being used together, because you see the bride adorned for her husband, so that's the clothing metaphor. But then you also see that the bride is what? It's the holy city, the New Jerusalem, and the dwelling place of God. So there's also the tabernacle or building metaphor, and they're just combined together. There's also the references to the priestly linen, which is the righteousness of the saints, Revelation 6:11 and 7:14. Then they were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be complete. And 7:14, these are those who came out of great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. And Revelation 19, it says, verse 8, it was granted her to clothe herself, referring to the bride, with fine linen, bright and pure, for the fine linen is the righteous deeds of the saints. Do you think that the righteous deeds of the saints here is referring to justification or sanctification? Klein doesn't address it, but I'm just asking what you think.
Boy, I haven't considered this for a while. Can you read the context again where that phrase appears?
Revelation 19,
okay.
The marriage supper of the Lamb. Let us rejoice and exult and give him glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. It was granted her to clothe herself with fine linen, bright and pure, for the fine linen is the righteous deeds of the saints. That's the ESV, righteous deeds, which seems to sort of answer the question in the favor of saying that it's sanctification.
Yeah.
But let me just...
At the same time, it's given to her.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, and in Greek, it doesn't... The word deeds is not present in Greek. In Greek, it just says...
The righteousness.
Well, ta dikaiomata. Righteous deeds. It's neuter plural. It could be righteous deeds, could be righteous characteristics. It's not entirely clear.
Okay. So, yeah, it does seem like sanctification, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I kind of lean in that direction. Or either sanctification or maybe even more, it's the fulfillment of sanctification in glorification, when she is made perfectly righteous. She's not only reckoned as righteous because of the righteousness of Christ, but she's made righteous. And, Ephesians 5.
Right. But I'm also thinking of Romans 8 with the being clothed upon with righteousness. Am I thinking of the right place?
Not sure which one you're referring to.
Okay, you go ahead and talk about Ephesians 5 while I look for what I'm talking about.
All right, I'm looking at Ephesians 5, verse 25. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle, or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. So it seems to me that this is referring to sanctification, but not to the imperfect sanctification that we experience now, but to the fulfillment of our sanctification when at glorification, when all sin is actually removed from us, and we are without spot or wrinkle and made perfectly holy and without blemish before the Lord.
Yeah.
And what was the verse you were looking at?
Well, I'm not seeing what I was thinking of. Maybe I was thinking back to 2 Corinthians 5 that we talked about earlier.
Yeah. right, where it talks about not that we would be unclothed, but that we would be further clothed. Right. And you translated it as clothed upon. But yeah, that's the resurrection body that is being put upon us like a garment. Mm-hmm. And then at that time, we will not only be judicially reckoned as righteous in God's sight because of the righteousness of Christ, but we will actually be righteous. We will be perfectly conformed to the image of the Son. Romans 8:29.
Yeah. So I actually like glorification better the more we talk about this, because it is the confirmation of both what Christ has done for us and in us. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, glorification.
Okay.
That's the answer. But some other things too that you see in Revelation 21 and 22 that show you the ways in which the church, as the bride of Christ, is being made in the image of Christ and therefore has a priestly quality to it. To her is, the gold, the references to the gold. The streets are paved with gold.
Right.
The fact that the New Jerusalem is a cube, the square shape, which reminds you back of the tabernacle. And then you mentioned this already, but the 12 stones are also very similar to the 12 precious stones on the breastplate of the high priest.
Right. And like you said, we haven't looked at whether they correspond exactly, but it is interesting that there's 12 in each case. Mm-hmm.
Revelation 21, verse 19, jasper, sapphire, agate, emerald, onyx, carnelian, chrysolite, beryl, topaz, chrysoprase, jacinth, and amethyst.
Oh, good on you for pronouncing all those.
Well, I don't know if I did correctly, but... And then another really interesting thing, we can just mention this very briefly, but Klein argues that we have sort of these biblical theological linkages, so we can link from Aaron to the church in Revelation 21 and 22 as the bride of Christ, but he sees an intermediate step before you get to Revelation 21 and 22, and that is in the book of Isaiah. In Isaiah 61 and 62, and also in Ezekiel 16. These are two passages that use the bride metaphor in reference to God's people. Mm-hmm. But the bride imagery in those two passages also have priestly aspects to them. And so Klein is then drawing a double linkage from Aaron to Isaiah and Ezekiel and the bride imagery, which has priestly images. And then from there, jumping over to Revelation 21 and 22. So there's like this intermediate step, which helps to provide some of the background for the vision of the bride of Christ in Revelation.
Wow. Which makes me think back to Ephesians 5 again. Mm-hmm. Because here the bride is being prepared, to be presented on that day, mm-hmm. just like the Spirit is reproducing his image in both creation and in the vestments of Aaron. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah, and by bringing up Ephesians 5, you're linking us even back from Aaron back to Adam, right? Mm-hmm. Because Ephesians 5 connects you back to Genesis 2 when it quotes, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife. So Adam and Eve, sort of a bridegroom-bride metaphor there. That's the original origin of this bride/priest motif that then jumps forward to Aaron and then to the Old Testament bride and then to the church in Revelation 21.
Wow.
And it's kind of interesting as well to point out another little link here, and that is 1 Corinthians 11, when Paul says that the the glory, the whole thing about the glory. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 7, a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. But the woman is the glory of man. Okay. So man is the image and glory of God. The woman is the glory of man. So the woman is like a replica of man, just like we were seeing with the bride of Christ being a replica of Christ.
Okay.
And being being recreated in the image of Christ. So the bride is like a further reproduction of the bridegroom. It is made in the bridegroom's image. So then Klein concludes this chapter by making some connections to the whole concept of the covenant. So we can just wrap this up in a few minutes here. But basically he's arguing that this whole concept of investiture, which is to clothe someone, this concept of investiture is a covenantal concept. And so he sees all these passages in the Old Testament, especially Ezekiel 16, which is God's description of how he entered into the covenant with Israel. And in that description of it, he describes it as a marriage, and how God, lifted up the corner of his robe and covered the bride with it, and he's adorning the bride with wedding garments, and all the language there in Ezekiel 16 has all these priestly overtones to it, clothing her with fine linen and with gold and silver and gems, and even having a crown on her head, just like the high priest has a crown. There's even a washing process that she goes through, just like the priests are anointed with oil. So all the priestly aspects of the bride imagery, but all of that is in the context of making a covenant. So the whole description of what's going on in Ezekiel 16 is Ezekiel looking back on the making of the covenant with Israel at Mount Sinai. And it's being described as a marriage and as the bridegroom adorning his bride. Verse 13, you were adorned with gold and silver, and your clothing was of fine linen and silk and embroidered cloth, and so on.
Wow. So and even there you see marriage and priestly garments coming together. Wow. But
then she, even though she was married to Yahweh, yet she went and she whored after her other gods. She trusted in her own beauty. She played the whore. And so there's this whole idea of the bride becoming a prostitute. But then the Lord is not going to give up on his bride. Even though she has broken the covenant, he's going to remember the covenant and reestablish the covenant, and he is going to marry them again. And this time he's going to marry them permanently, and they will never go back to their old ways.
Which is what we're seeing in Revelation 21 and 22.
That's right. And there's a nice quote here on page 53 of Images of the Spirit. Klein writes, according to Ezekiel's interpretation, God's spreading of his glory cloud as a canopy over Israel, the equivalent action of setting up his tabernacle to receive Israel in her priesthood under its covering, and the further equivalent of clothing Israel's priests with the glory vestments, all signified God's ratification of his covenant with Israel. So when you're reading in Exodus, they come to Mount Sinai, chapter 19. You have the giving of the law in chapter 20. You have the oath where the blood is sprinkled on the people and on the book in Exodus 24. And then it goes right into, here's all the instructions for making the tabernacle and the instructions for clothing the priests with their vestments. And you might think, okay, this is something separate going on here. This is a new topic or something. But Klein is saying, no, this is the making of the covenant. The action of spreading the glory canopy over Israel, as well as the action of setting up the tabernacle and then clothing the priests, all these covering actions, these are enacted forms of entering into a covenant.
Wow.
Just like in a marriage, where the man lifts up the corner of his robe and he covers the woman with it. And so this is the act of entering into a marriage, the act of entering into a marriage covenant.
The whole thing, everything we're reading about in Exodus is the covenant.
Yeah,
wow.
Exactly. And then Klein has this section here where he talks about God's name. He shows that God's name is another term for God's glory, because when it talks about the glory cloud coming into the tabernacle, and then later on he'll say God will put his name in the sanctuary. Mm-hmm. So the name and the glory are the same thing. And so putting his name upon his people is the same thing as putting the glory upon his people. And that's a covenantal thing when God does that. Then he turns to the New Testament and says, we're Christians, right? We're those that bear the name of Christ. So we have the name of Christ put upon us. So that's a covenantal action. We are members of the new covenant because we are bearers of the name of Christ. And then, having made all these connections from Ezekiel 16 back to Exodus, and then from Ezekiel 16 forward to the new covenant, Revelation 21, then he goes all the way back to creation and says, this all supports the idea that when God was making man in his image, that he was clothing him with his glory spirit. He was clothing him with God's name. And therefore that means that by doing that, by making man in his image, he was entering into a covenant with man at creation. And so then he concludes the chapter by showing that you have all the elements that you see in Ezekiel 16. Ezekiel 16 is clearly a passage describing the covenant ceremony, but it's describing it using this imagery of the marriage and of the covering. And then he goes back to Genesis 1 and says, you see the same thing there. You see God's covering. You see God being invested and clothed with the image of God. And then you also see the marriage covenant. And so he points out that the marriage between Adam and Eve is connected to and is sort of like a miniature picture of the bigger thing that's happening, which is God entering into a covenant with mankind, with Adam as the head, the covenant of works. So it's a marriage covenant on that broader scale as well. But there in that one, though, it's between God and his people, not just with Adam. It's Adam as the head, but it's also with the human race.
Example 836, how Klein just makes it all one story.
Yeah.
He doesn't make it. He just helps us to see that it really is one plan of God, one program of God. And the whole Bible just comes together as a whole unit, not a bunch of separate stories that are, mashed together.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah, and the last sentence here is, Christ in the church. Christ takes his church, his image wife, in covenant of marriage to bear his glory and his name, to be the fullness of him who fills all in all.
Amen.
Wonderful.
It is. Well, I think that covers chapter 2. Is there anything else that we need to say by way of wrapping up?
I think just keep in your mind just this one thing, which is these two metaphors of dwelling and clothing. 2 Corinthians 5, that's really what this whole chapter is about, and seeing that priestly model of the image of God in both the tabernacle and in the priestly vestments. I think that's a nice summation of everything.
That is. And a great note to end on. Lee, thank you very much for this discussion. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, everyone. Thank you for tuning in this week. Hope you enjoyed chapter 2 of Images of the Spirit. We would really love to hear from you, hear what you're thinking. So you can email us at glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com, or you can tweet us, or you can send us voicemail. We'd love to hear from you. See you next week.